We're just letting a few people filter in. We'll maybe give it a couple of minutes before we get officially started. But welcome to the digital launch of KINK BANDS by David Martin. We're very excited to have you all here. Just so everyone is aware, and I will say this, of course, as more people come in, but we are recording this launch with the intention of posting on wonderful YouTube later so people can see it after the fact. If you're uncomfortable with being recorded in any way, we fully support you. And unfortunately, we won't turn it off, but you know what I mean. But if you're uncomfortable being recorded, please let us know. And we will do our best. There's also closed captioning if that is required for anyone. It can be turned on at the bottom of your screens with the CC Show Captions button. Give it a couple more minutes here, and then we'll get started. Okay, may as well just get started and some more people can filter in as they come. Welcome, everyone. My name is Meredith Thompson. I'm the production coordinator at New West Press. Before we get started fully, I would love to welcome Bree, our wonderful representative of Audrey's Bookstore, our official bookseller, to do a quick land acknowledgement.
Hi, thank you. Yes, I'll pull that up here. Hello, my name is Bree. I am your digital bookseller for today, and I would like to acknowledge that we are located on Amiskwichi, Wiskahikan, on Treaty 6 territory and Métis Region 4, a traditional meeting ground, gathering place, and traveling route of many Indigenous nations, such as the Cree, Dene, Nakota Sioux, Métis, Blackfoot, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, and Inuit, who have cared for this land since time immemorial. We encourage you all to reaffirm your relationship with each other and the land on which we gather, but also to engage meaningfully with Indigenous works and Indigenous voices. Thank you. Did you want me to post the link for? Yeah, so we have several copies of David's book in the store. I'm going to post the link where you can purchase them online or reserve a copy for yourself online. And that is in the chat now.
Perfect. And if you have any questions throughout, the chat is being monitored by New West's own Carolina Ortiz, our marketing coordinator. So if you have any issues, any questions, anything like that, just shoot it in the chat and Carolina will be sure to make sure you get heard. So before we get started fully, I would just like to say a little bit about New West. So New West Press, founded in 1977 and located in Edmonton, Alberta, is one of Canada's first independent literary publishing houses. New West publishes literary fiction, literary nonfiction, poetry, drama, and mysteries, with a particular interest in books by Western Canadian authors. Its Nunatak imprint is the longest-running first fiction series in Canada, Notable New West titles include Blood Relations and Other Plays by Sharon Pollock, Icefields by Thomas Wharton, The Widows by Suzette Mayer, All of Baba's Children by Myrna Kostash, Molly of the Mall by Heidi L.M. Jacobs, which is a very funny book, and Ezra's Ghosts by Darcy Tamayose. We publish about 10 to 12 books a year. So I'm very excited to be introducing our reader, author, star of this evening to celebrate. I'm realizing the tapestry on my wall matches your book cover, David. There's a blue tapestry behind me, and there's a teal book cover. They look quite similar in the best way. So we are celebrating the launch of KINK Bands. This is David Martin's second poetry collection with New West. We're very excited to be publishing David again. So David Martin works as a literacy instructor in Calgary and as an organizer for the Single Onion Poetry Series, which hopefully maybe you can tell us a little bit about later if you want, David. David's work has been awarded the CBC Poetry Prize and has been shortlisted for prizes from Free Fall, Vallum, and Prison International, as well as his poems having appeared in numerous journals and magazines across Canada. So David's first collection with us was Tar Swans, which I feel like you can also get through Audrey's. I think. If not, they can order anything in for you. They're great. It was published in 2018, and it was the first publication of the Crow Said poetry series, which began in honor of New West's 40th anniversary to sit alongside the Ninnetak First Fiction, Prairie Play, and Writer's Critic series. Crow Said is named in honor of Robert Croce's foundational 1977 novel, What the Crow Said. The series aims to shed light on places and people outside of the literary mainstream. Poets featured in this series continue Robert Croce's literary tradition of innovation, interrogation, and generosity of spirit. I cannot think of a better collection to have begun this tradition than David Martin's Tar Swan, or to have added a new book to this series in KINK Bands. So Tar Swan was I'm going to brag about David for a little bit now. Tar Swan was shortlisted for the 2019 Raymond Schuster Award. It was a finalist for the 2019 City of Calgary W.L. Mitchell Book Prize. It was the winner of the 2019 Alberta Book Publishing Awards Book Design Award. David's work has been called remarkable by Prairie Journal, which I love. My favorite is A Wild Ride. I like that one. I always think I quote that one, which is in Alberta Views, and it's by New West's own Sid Marty, which makes me happy. David was also named one of CBC Books' Writers to Watch in 2023, and KINK Bands, I'm holding it up again for reference, was named one of Read Alberta's highly anticipated Alberta books, which is wonderful. So this collection, in his second book of poems, David Martin digs deep into an examination of the world using the lens of geology. With lyrically experimental poems expanding and retracting, this collection finds sonic and conceptual energy from the perspective of deep time and the geological forces that have shaped and continue to shape the Earth, enacting seismic shifts and catastrophes and erosions throughout the natural and cultural worlds. Martin's poetic practice pushes forward to contend with the contemporary environmental changes and the structure of the Anthropocene that affect how we live in the 21st century. The collection veers from the Rocky Mountains and explorations of fossilized towns to family histories and myth-soaked theories, all while seeking a balance between disruptive poetic techniques and the centered lyrical voice. I'm very excited to welcome the wonderful David Martin to give us a reading.
Thanks so much, Meredith, and thanks to Bree for being our online bookseller and host this evening. Thanks everyone for coming. I appreciate it. I was just saying I haven't done an online reading in a while. Well, later on, I'll let you know about the Single Onion because our events are also available online, so people want to tune in for those. I'll read some poems from KINK Bands, and then I think Meredith has a few questions to kind of have a little bit of discussion. And if people have some questions as well, they can pop them in the chat, and I'll do my best to answer them. The first poem I'm going to read is called Plasticlomerate. This is the first poem in the collection. Plasticlomerate is a term given by scientists to sort of this new type of rock that they're discovering that's made up of natural sediments and natural objects like wood, but that's been held together by molten plastic. And it's strange that we're kind of creating this new layer of rock that's showing up in the lithic record. So that really kind of caught my attention, and I started to learn about plastiglomerate. So the poem moves from some different ancient ideas about what mountains were, like why they were there, and it kind of goes through this journey until eventually we arrive at this place where now we're creating this plastiglomerate. So it goes like this. This mountain swells with unfurled terrain tides. This mountain pickets the continental divide. This mountain lords its frozen obligatos over range road staves. This mountain writhed from surf to stack its fins. This mountain corrals river riots and breakers battering roots. This mountain bullies ocean airs into gambling savings, crows as they sulk shirtless, parched down the lee side exit from town. This mountain's a suck up to sun's aspect angle, self-conscious of its latitudinal rusticity. This mountain siphons lung bellows. This mountain's a shredded sin shell, marooned after the yoke flooded our mundane world. This mountain coerces Gorgon wannabes into fermenting mineral memory. This mountain chaperones us to a vacated beach where we ransack forensic rucksacks and sacrifice a drained Fanta to the flames of a new fate. We fret the plastic silhouette in fishing nets, torture form in fire, bury the effigy under sandcastles so it will hatch molecular hook hands to wrangle bilious basalt, cloak its hunks of coral shivs and snuffed shells. While we doze, bottle is abducted by subduction, and in deep time dreams the artificial moment is our contribution to the lithic record, signing a hail and farewell from bedrock to futures. The second poem I'm going to share with you is called Nicholas Steno Opens a Door. Nicholas Steno was a 17th century bishop, and he's kind of considered the father of the modern study of geology. And he was famously torn between these kind of two sides of his life, between his religious convictions and kind of the scientific discoveries that he was making about the age of the earth and the different lithic layers that he was kind of uncovering and thinking about. The poem kind of takes some twists and turns, but the first line, as strange as it sounds, is actually true. Mr. Medici was kind enough to mail me a shark, and when I had fitted my head within its jaws, I saw its teeth were not strangers, like those feisty angles I tread upon when beach-bound. Whereas Pliny says fossils are tossed from the moon, and Kircher lectures they are geocosmic tears, I trust this beast could devour a mountain, play perpendicular with epochs to discipline me for silt rungs, pilot my pocket watch gears. I remove my mind from this mouth and chant. A carnivore is a door to our petrified future. Entombed upright, I'm sealed with a sleeping shark, fostered in my arms to prove all that rises once lay down. The next poem that I'm going to share is called Slab Saw. This kind of has two inspirations. The first was I had been reading a book about dust, which does not sound very exciting, but was actually a really fascinating book. And I learned that lichens will grow into these little cracks in rocks. They absorb water and they kind of crack open the rocks, creating dust, and then they eat the dust as kind of like a mineral food. So I thought that was fascinating. And then that got me thinking about, I had this very brief career as a concrete cutter, which only lasted a few weeks. And thinking about the dangers of breathing in the kind of the dust that gets brought up from cutting concrete and what that does to the lungs, things like that. So this is called Slab Saw. Outside the shop, lichens are liquors. They smuggle hyphae tongues into rock flaws, chug vapor, bloat, then frack lithic treasure. In cahoots to bleed out a map, algae and fungi sod bust for squalid idlers. Dust is a ghost given up, mineral soul for gobbling. My slurry jeans are 2 steps behind Henry's saw, evicting plates from the road. I vacuum silt sluiced from a wet cut screen. But a veil of quartz flourishes around us as microscopic shards get napped into bifaces, blades, by diamond fangs spinning a smirk. Lunch. Steel toes shored on desk, drawers glutted with butts. Moldy mugs, tarred phone books. Henry again telling how the wife slept with his best friend, so he plowed a car into his house. And in our lungs, macrophages purse their lips to siphon silica grit. But those fluted points skewer the centuries, leaving breathless constellations shivering in an X-ray's midnight. I'm at the wheel, testing brakes play, as Henry ouija's the radio dial, with smoke cloaking his fuzzed laugh, and lichens still dividing up dust. The next poem I'm going to share is called Eroded Travel. This is the longest poem in the collection, and it kind of takes some of these explorations and ideas around geology, which sort of course throughout the whole collection, but turns it to a more kind of personal focus, thinking about a journey that my family took, visiting glaciers and thinking about what that means as those glaciers recede, and sort of trying to bring together a lot of different ideas into this one narrative poem. So this is called Eroded Travel. The car pitches west under Devonian shades, while our kids limb drumlins swelling past windows. We should be sighting front ranges, but Yamnuska's puckered mask is swarmed by a stratus pack. We're bound for a glacier's snout, more monastic with each season, which rations out chatter marks between ice today and when I last faced the terminus. Stretch break by a scarp announcing its anticline. My daughter grins at potato stones, woken from a bed the stream has ditched. She heaves refined cobbles. A scuttling course tucks the lobs in a duvet of held breath, and her face casts for more. Tacoed rock in hand, my son asks why earth folds itself. With my boots ruffling water's zeal, I wonder how to render the years for bending shale, when this trip to him makes an era. If we took this creek at its word and braced for an argument with the city, we could alight at a shore to watch high rises accumulating and drape our arms over a lacquered bench engraved with my brother's name. The highway unveils a cement plant, shoots gnashing a carbonate cache. Stalks strip the quarry, wad up prey, and hoard clinkers in a sealed dome. In lieu of erosion's slow slashing, these cookers increase nature's speed, deposit concrete along the trough and into braided roads. Continent's ballast is rebalanced by the shells and bones paving our path. A man my children will never meet. The date is concretion in my mind, a swelling nucleus that siphons memories embedded in tide strata, exposed by a voice on the radio that fractures an outcrop, revealing this strange ball of grief. 16 years since he died. My son begs the disc to skip, skirt the skin of water's machine, but he gives up in a sunken galumph. His arms, young Ark can't master the knuckle knack needed to syncopate a flowing ostinato, while my wife whips stones that suture across liquid wounds. My brother is the KT boundary, seared through family seams, gaunt line visible after impact. Alien elements, shocked quartz, cross this threshold from rock to room, his mute moraine of clutter, empty fridge, cigarettes in the freezer, signature signifying he's not coming back. Switchbacking by foot up the ridge, our souls scuff petrified corals. Athabasca, outwashing from toe, rejects our advances. Son and daughter pose before a glacier their lives will outlast. Aging will metamorphose them into forms beyond my recognition. How should I explain that uniformity of Earth can be jarred during their own microscopic span? We freeze for a photograph, but the present is ablating. Our bygones bleed via moulins into aquifers. We are here to see the going. About face at the Stygian off-ramp with its Hades stewed slate. Purple plates scoffing as our tail lights shrink. We wind back on unwound ropes of asphalt. My son cups a quartzite memento that magnetizes his return. Ice remains a retreating burden. Wind rasp curdles in my ears. This next poem is called Kootenai Group. There's a number of small poems kind of dotted throughout the collection, and some of them are very kind of languagey and dense. And the idea is they kind of act as little poetic outcrops. And in this case, my father-in-law, who's a retired geologist, took me to view this little outcrop just outside of Canmore. And the reason he wanted to show it to me was just because it was so strange. There were so many different layers that were all kind of messed up, and fractures and faults going all over the place. And the idea was like it would be really almost impossible to kind of figure out what's going on geologically in this little space here. So this is called Kootenai Group. This outcrop chops logic. A blender of interbedded shale and silt, smuggled in glacial meal, is exhumed by clastic talking cures. Hair-pinning rube seams fist-bump mudstone squatters chugging O2 brews, while boho aspens snort coal to cook up a scree of showboating fancy dams. En route to a cirque scoop, a lamp house stockpiles slag. Moss plots cements nap, reclaiming dimpled vugs. Sphagnum beards hum here. And I just have a couple more poems that I'll share with you. This next one is based on another kind of geological idea that I came across in my research, something called legacy pollutants. So during the 20th century, there was a number of chemicals that were used quite regularly, such as DDT. And we stopped using them once we realized how harmful they were. But a number of those chemicals had evaporated into the atmosphere and then precipitated onto glaciers. And now as certain glaciers are melting and receding, a number of these chemicals that we thought were gone forever are coming back to haunt us. So this is a poem called Reunion. We're closing in on the toe of Athabasca Glacier, trailing chatter marks and striations. The ice advances and recedes each day, smeared in rusty microbes that blunt albedo. This field is a pollutant cold storage, inheritance stilled and stunned whitecaps. Our tread marks sinter the snow, fusing flakes by evicting blisters of air. We sidestepped moulins that seduce our path, striving to devour another hiker. Beneath the fern's seal, split-leg molecules of DDT camouflage, sweating it out. Entombed in a wintry womb, these microscopic seeds pine to teem back into mainstreams. Prodigal isomers remind me this chemical bond is for life. Nerve signals crowed open, eggshells leached of calcium, sperm tranquilized, and cancer frenzied in the liver. When the ice at last ablates and meltwater punctures the terminal moraine's lip, human residues will lie as stowaways, sown in outwash, nested in water tables. We stand on the frozen grade, knowing the next snowfall will scumble our tracks, while molecular scrimmage seethes in the glacial cage, primed to dog its way home. I have one final poem to share with everyone. This is a poem called Petrified Willow Leaves. This one is a bit odd. It takes a little bit of an explanation. It's dedicated to William Barnes, who was a poet and philologist, meaning like studied language. And he had this idea that he wanted to remove kind of the Greek and the Latin that was part of English. He wanted to kind of re-English English. So he came up with this this word list of words that he would kind of switch out and change, but they ended up sounding almost, way stranger than the words that we're kind of used to, even though they're from Latin. So it never really caught on. But I liked the idea of thinking of it as kind of a linguistic fossil, that in the record of our language and all the different changes, there's this weird little fossil sitting there. And so this is a poem about a fossil called Petrified Willow Leaves, but it uses his kind of version of English that he was trying to come up with. And I also kind of like it because I don't 100% know what the poem would mean. I would have to kind of translate it back to sort of totally figure it out. So here we go. O falsome thing forestoned, what brangle brought you here? Thorough shining leaves once groom, full ended now, breaksome with fear. High deedy earth whips life grist, your kin stem forefrets in checkless time. A faith law enholds you with frozen return vows to welcome heirs prime. Foreknotted breath terrored the man who trode we so continents to be. Upcleaning limbs unfriend the bowl, but wind quickening still is matterly. And I just have a few thank yous to send out, and I'll turn it back over to Meredith. I wanted to thank everybody at New West Press, Matt, Meredith, Carolina, Christine. It's been really wonderful to work with the press again. I wanted to give a big thanks to my amazing editor at New West Press, Jenna Butler. She really believed in this book, and it was wonderful to work with her again. I want to thank Natalie Olson for doing the cover and the design. That was really awesome. Thanks to Robin Wojciechowska and my father-in-law Bob Cortero for their technical advice. Thanks to all of you for coming out this evening to watch. Thanks to Audrey's Books for being our online co-host, and thanks to Meredith for being our online host. And Meredith gave a little introduction about the history of the press. And when I was in Edmonton, I just took a moment to kind of recognize Doug Barber, who was one of the founders of New West Press back in 1977. Sadly, Doug passed away in 2021. And I just wanted to again kind of recognize what an amazing thing he did in starting this press. And when I was in Edmonton talking with some friends of Doug's, who were my former professors at the U of A, Bert Allman and Olga Kostopoulos-Allman, they mentioned that not only did Doug put up the money to start New West Press, I knew that, but that he had mortgaged his house to get the money to start the press. And I kept thinking, what would you say to the bank if you were looking for your some money? So it's a really amazing legacy that he's left behind, and we really do miss Doug. And then lastly, I'm part of the Single Onion Poetry Reading Series. Our events are held in Calgary at Shelf Life Books, but they're also hybrid events. So even though they're live and in person, they're also streamed online. And it's very similar to this. If you go to our website, there's a little link where you can sign up and register, and then you can watch our events. So even if you're coming to us from Edmonton or anywhere, you can still join in and be part of the Single Onion. And our next event is this Thursday. We're really excited because the Poet Laureate of Victoria, her name is Marie Specht, she will be joining us. And I'm excited to see her because we were classmates in a creative writing course at the U of A many, many years ago. So it'll be nice to catch up with her. So Meredith, I'll hand it back to you.
Such a small world. And Carolina has put the link to the Single Onion website in the chat, which is very helpful because, yeah, that sounds amazing. I didn't realize your guys' events were hybrid. That's super cool. And thank you for mentioning Doug. That's wonderful. And I feel like it was the 70s. It's easier to say you want to start a press and no one judges you quite as intensely. Especially because Doug was so interested in poetry. I imagine it's like a slightly harder sell. Poetry and sci-fi. Matt always, our general manager, Matt Bose, who's currently at the Frankfurt Book Fair, otherwise he would definitely be here, always talks about how Doug Barber was one of the first people in Edmonton, I think actually in Western Canada, but don't quote me on that, to take science fiction seriously as a book reviewer and to, as a critic, very much take science fiction seriously. And so at the Book Publishers Association of Alberta, is a tongue twister, the Speculative Fiction Award is now named after Doug. Very rightly so.
Fantastic.
We have a couple of lovely things I want to point out in the chat. First of all, there's a link from Audrey's for Tar Swan, which is also excellent. It's like, I wouldn't say it's about the tar sands, so there's like kind of rocks happening, but it's not. I don't think there's would you say there's a direct link, David?
No, I don't think so. Tar Swan is sort of built as more of a book-length narrative with different voices kind of telling a story as part of the oil sands. And then Kink Bands is a little bit more here and there, but sort of held together with this idea of geological forces. So it's, yeah.
Cool. John is congratulating your concrete cutting skills. And Allison has pointed out some wonderful lines, which I would also like to draw attention to. The first being dust, a ghost given up, a beautiful line. The second being entombed in a wintry womb. I really like when you describe the radio as, what is it, Ouija?
Yeah,
it's
Ouija.
such a
radio, yeah.
It's such a perfect way to describe a more old school radio. Okay, I have some questions, and then everyone can have as many questions as they want within a reasonable amount of time. First question, and this was funny because when I asked you this at the in-person launch, you were like, there's a geologist sitting right there. But now I don't think there's a geologist here. If there is, please put your name in the chat and we'll get you to, no, okay. What are kink bands, David?
So it's a good question. Kink bands are a special type of geological formation where there's kind of a lot of pressure moving on the rock, and there's nowhere for it to go. So sometimes with enough time and a certain amount of pressure, you can get these kind of folds. So if it folds this way, it's called an anticline. If it folds this way, it's called a syncline. They all have like special names. And sometimes if there's pressure, then you'll get like a fault and it'll kind of break and move over it. But in this case, if there's a lot of slow motion pressure and there's nowhere for it to go, you get these really strange angular kind of jagged formations. And they're really cool to look at. But I also kind of like the idea of thinking of the kink bands as kind of a metaphor for being under this kind of pressure and then sort of this physical response to the type of pressure. So it sort of just became kind of a guiding metaphor or image for the book rather than something like super specific to explore.
No, I love that because the book itself, it has sort of a cohesive structure and feel, but the poems individually do kind of twist and turn. It's not like taking a single idea. Sorry, our pictures changed. It blew my mind for a second. It's not like you put all the lyric poems in one section and you sort of had like a flow. Like it has these very jagged movements, which I love.
Mm-hmm.
I think it
It
allows
can
you
be
to fix it.
kind of a whiplash at certain times, like who's talking. Yeah.
Totally, 100%. Excellent. I like this answer. My next question, and it's a super chill question. What is deep time?
Deep time is a term that's been given for geologic time. So for like the age of the Earth and going through the geological periods, there's this idea of how do we even understand that as humans? Like we our brains really can't handle that type of timeline. So that's where this idea was coined to call it deep time.
Mm.
What's fascinating is when people talk about deep time, they often have to use metaphors to explain it, because we can say 2 billion years or whatever, but that we just can't conceive of that. So one kind of metaphor that famous writer John McPhee used was, if you think about the entire length of the Earth as being like your sort of entire arm length, then the time that humans have existed is like just a little nick coming off of your fingernail. And so I like this idea that when we're dealing with geological things, because it's so supersized, we have to kind of by necessity rely on metaphor to kind of explain and understand it. So I think there's kind of this overlap between poetry and the geological sciences in that sense.
Definitely. And we paired you for your in-person launch with Jaspreet Singh, who writes sort of hybrids. Well, like, he would disapprove of that term. He writes poetry interested in the Anthropocene, and he's interested in a scientific, not method to his poetry, but in taking into account in his poetic work a scientific way of thinking, a scientific world. And that similarity, which he pointed out, I'm like waving my pencil at the camera, I'll calm down. The similarity he pointed out between poets and scientists in the use of metaphor is something I'd never thought of. And that's exactly what you just said. And I really like that. The reason I ask about deep time is because on your cover copy, which I'm very proud of, I think that you and Janet did a fabulous job on that. You talk about kink bands inhabiting. Let me see if I can just find it exactly.
I don't know what I said.
Wait, you remember what you said? You said something about inhabiting the perspective of deep time. Yes, here it is. This collection finds sonic and conceptual energy from the perspective of deep time. And I'm fascinated by the idea of that being a perspective. So is there anything you would like to elaborate in that area?
Yeah, I think, well, deep time is kind of woven into a lot of the poems, because you're even if it's kind of a realist journey and you're looking at a formation, you're looking at it in the moment, but what you're seeing is the product of millions of years of slow motion change and huge tectonic pressures that have created this formation. And I like that idea that it's sort of a single moment that you're witnessing, but you're also witnessing millions of years kind of captured in that one moment. So I think that's kind of what I mean by inhabiting deep time.
Definitely. I like that answer. I have two new questions that I would love to ask you, and then I would love to open it up to everyone to ask questions. I am absolutely fascinated by can you talk a bit about your poetic practice? Like, do you like spend a lot of time contemplating and then write the words and don't really change them? Do you sort of throw everything at the wall and then edit it down? What is your practice?
I think it kind of changes for each project that I'm working on. This one, I would be doing sort of very specific research. I was taking courses on geology online, reading a lot of books. My father-in-law would take me on trips out into the Rocky Mountains to kind of show me these different formations. And then as I would kind of come across these ideas, I would do a bunch of research. And then, yeah, I think usually a first draft of the poem can kind of come out pretty quickly, but then it's going to be quite a long process, often letting the poem sit for a long time, coming back to it several months later or even a year later, and then seeing if I can do something completely different with it, if I'm not happy with it, if there's some totally different way that I can approach it. So even that long poem, A Roaded Trip, that took several years to write and had like many different kind of versions of it before I kind of felt like it was sitting in the right the right feel. And the one Reunion about going and looking for on the glacier, that one originally almost started as like a kind of a concrete poem, but when I had a friend read it, he felt like there's sort of this narrative beneath that, and I needed to explore that a little bit more. So sometimes I'll work with poets, people that I know and really respect their work, and get some feedback from them just to kind of see how are they interpreting the poem, what are they getting out of it, am I kind of going down the wrong path, and is there and sometimes you just have to almost like start it over or just try something completely different. So I think if you some of the poems probably stayed similar, but for the majority of them, there's probably a huge change from the initial draft to the final product. But maybe that's a little bit different with some of the later projects that I'm working on now. They might be a bit more stable, whereas this is more kind of in the science lab, seeing what I can experiment with and cook up.
That's funny. Yeah, no, I love that idea. I'm thinking about it from a publishing perspective, in that how clean it was when it arrived to the press, and how few changes we made in the proofreading process. Like, you and Jenna had worked through it entirely. Do you workshop your pieces through any sort of speaking series that you participate in, or do you only read things that you are really comfortable with?
Usually I just read poems that I feel are pretty finished. I know sometimes people will kind of test out a first draft and get a response from people and then maybe kind of change it. I don't really feel comfortable doing that, so I don't. But I will. I was lucky to work with the poet Adam Dickinson, who used to live in Edmonton, and he's really fantastic at combining like science and poetry. Another poet who kind of explores that. And so he read an early version of the manuscript and had some really great feedback, like, I like this poem, but maybe it doesn't really belong in this manuscript, or this poem is interesting, but maybe it's not quite doing what it should be doing. Maybe reorder some poems. So getting some feedback like that was really helpful. And then by the time we're kind of doing that final edit, I like doing that one because it's sort of just finding those little tiny things. And Jenna's brilliant at that, like finding that little tiny word, like, can we change this one word? And just to see if that, makes the line kind of click into place. So I like that type of editing as well.
Definitely. We've got a couple of questions in the chat. I'm going to ask one more question while everyone else thinks of their questions, because I'm sure most people will have a question. Because this is also just a personal question. I'm intrigued. What do you feel about formal structured poetry and experimental poetry? Because you get labeled as experimental a lot, but your poetic experiments, which, as was pointed out to us, is a hilarious term for something that's unduplicatable,
right,
are so clearly based in such knowledge of poetic structure, of poetic, like the history of poetry, of literary theory. Like, it's very clear that you are incredibly intentional in your writing, and yet your writing appears on first glance to be wildly experimental. I'm thinking specifically of the poems that sort of cascade down the page, like they're sort of falling words. There's a poem that is an equation, although that's a highly structured poem, but an experimental structure. But yeah, I'm interested in your view, because I know you engage with classic literature.
Yeah, I don't know. I've been thinking more and more about formal structures, and this is almost relating to some other projects. One of them will be coming out next year, and the idea that by working within a very narrow, restricted form, you actually create the opportunity for kind of freedom and creativity and expression, which seems counterintuitive. So normally there's kind of this traditional binary that old forms of poetry were rhyming and metered and stanzaic, and then the modernists in the early 20th century kind of threw that off and got rid of all this stuff and had free verse, supposedly, which is more free. But there's a number of writers and who kind of have this idea that if you are just sort of writing whatever you want, you have kind of subconscious things that are restricting what you're going to say and how you're going to say it. But if you give yourself very clear, demarcated restrictions, like you can only use these certain words, or it has to be this length or whatever, suddenly you open up these possibilities of creativity in your thinking that you weren't really aware of before. And so there's kind of this paradox between giving yourself a really restricted form and then seeing what you can find with it. Probably the weirdest one in Kink Bands is the one rock. I didn't read this one, but rock versus stone cold, where it's a conversation between a rock and a stone, and the idea is they kind of explore that there's this subtle scientific difference between what is a rock and what is a stone, and basically it's like if it's untouched by humans or kind of has turned into a tool. But I wrote that poem restricting myself to the lexicon of a conversation that was held between Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson and Stone Cold Steve Austin in a wrestling match.
Oh my God, I love that.
So
That's perfect.
that, as absurd as that sounds, like that's the only words I could use were words that they kind of yelled at each other. And so
Yeah.
that's a new lexicon. And I want to explain this sort of division or this distinction between rock and stone using this kind of comical yelling match that they're having. So, and it seems really bizarre, but then it's kind of a challenge. Okay, these are the only words you have. How can you still explore this and kind of see what you can come up with? So I more and more I'm kind of interested in those ideas of maybe everything should rhyme, or it's not always that fashionable, but I like the idea of putting that pressure on the poem to see what you can kind of generate creatively. So yeah, I'm not sure if I really see a huge distinction between kind of experimental or maybe sort of traditional formalist. I like, but I usually like having this some sort of like guiding principle or some sort of guiding structure to it. Maybe that's what it is either if it's an experimental one where I'm using like a mathematical formula or something, or using a traditional structure, there's still this kind of frame that's kind of guiding me as the poet. And I find, yeah, that kind of paradoxically that actually can create creative opportunities.
I love that answer. That reminds me so much of, this is such a random example, but of Jack White from the White Stripes. I tend to always think about poetry and music. To me, those just kind of make more sense in my brain as structuring poetry and writing in general in a more musical way. And Jack White talks about the way to reach your creative potential is by limiting yourself to like 3 instruments or whatever. And within those limits, that is where your creativity comes from. And I love that.
Yeah, definitely. I like that idea that instead of having access to every instrument in the world, he's saying, okay, you only get these 3, but what can you create with those
exactly.
that you have? And then suddenly you have to be more creative and innovative in how you're going to use those tools that you have. So yeah, I like that idea. I find it very generative.
Yeah, definitely. I love that because yeah, your stuff feels incredibly experimental, for lack of a less broad word, but also feels incredibly structured, which I think is very, very valuable. I, however, have dominated this question and answer period. So we have questions. John would like to know if you have any favorite glaciers.
That's a good question. It would my wife and I went to visit the Athabasca Glacier a few years ago. That was really amazing. I haven't been to too many glaciers. I like exploring them. But what was fascinating about going to the Athabasca Glacier is you kind of park and then you go on this long walk to reach the glacier. And as you're walking, they have all these signs that show where the glacier was at a certain year. So back in like the 1850s, the glacier was all the way at the parking lot, and then it's receded and retreated and melted over the last 150 years. And you can kind of see those signs, and then you can see, okay, like this is the year roughly when I was born, the glacier would have been here, and now we're continuing to walk and we're still not there yet. So you're kind of physically encountering that idea of how much that has changed. And that was really cool being at the Athabasca Glacier, because I'd seen photos. Sometimes you'll see these really dramatic photos of like a historical glacier and then a glacier now. But to kind of walk that distance, I thought that was really amazing. And so maybe I'll call that my favorite glacier.
You could have more than one. It was plural. And then Allison would like to know, do you enjoy hiking? And if so, do you hike a lot?
I do enjoy hiking. I don't get out as much, but my family will go out for some hikes in the Rocky Mountains. I'm not really like a mountain climber, so they're not really extreme hikes. They're more kind of like family friendly hikes. But I really do enjoy kind of getting out into the natural world. I'm not a big like camper, so I don't really want to go hiking and then tent somewhere. I like the idea of being back in my own bed by the end of the day.
I relate to that.
But in Calgary, we're very lucky because within a day's drive, there's a lot of really amazing places that we can visit and explore. You can get out to Canmore and Banff. A few years ago, my wife and I did a guided tour through a cave, which is just outside of Canmore. And that was really cool. It's called the Rat's Nest Cave. There's a poem about that too. So I kind of like these little mini adventures that you can have in Calgary by kind of going out into the mountains, and you don't have to make like a 2-month, journey and leave your family behind kind of thing. You can bring the family.
I've been using just first names because we're a little group today, but we do have multiple Williams. So William Thompson has said, he's got a 2-part question. What was the name of the book about dust? I agree. That does sound really interesting.
I want to say it's something like Dust, a History or something like that. It was called like I think it was called A History of Dust. It's been a long time since I read it. I just sort of saw it at the library. It was with sort of the geological books, and I thought, this is pretty weird. I will get this book. And it turned out to be very interesting. It must have been a hard sell to a publisher, like, hey, what do you want to write about? I want to write about dust. I think most people would have passed on that. Yeah, I'll have to take a look. I can't quite remember. I think it was called like A History of Dust or something like that.
The second part of the question is, how would you define the Anthropocene in relation to your own poetry and research?
That's another good question. So from a geological perspective, the Anthropocene is kind of defined as when human interaction and changes to the earth are showing up in the lithic record. And so there's a lot of, first of all, some geologists don't necessarily recognize it as like a true geological age. So there's that kind of division within the science. And then there's the question of, well, when do you start it? And so some people look to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and sort of those changes, like maybe that's the beginning of the Anthropocene. Other people look to some like the atomic experiments and things that were going on in the 40s, that maybe that's sort of the true. So there's not an easy definition of when it begins. I think for my own poetry, it's always kind of, it's probably not something like I'm directed by saying I'm going to write about the Anthropocene, but it ends up being something that I explore in a lot of my work. So if in the first book it's the history of the oil sands and kind of wondering, how did we get here? And it almost kind of imagines this mythology, the sort of mythological beginning to this industry, which is so enormous in Alberta, but we almost really can't think about it. It's just like so big. So it was trying to find like a narrative to trace that. And then with the geological poems, it's always kind of thrumming in the background. So I'm looking at these ancient ideas, these rock formations, these things that have taken millions of years to be created and kind of show up or to be exposed. But then there can be these incredibly sudden changes that can occur, and that's kind of what we're seeing in the Anthropocene is the human involvement in the environment and in the natural world that's creating these enormous changes that normally would take tens of thousands of years to see. That could be part of natural cycles of glaciers and melting, and that's been going on for tens of thousands of years. But now we're kind of seeing it in this kind of fast forward motion. So I think it's always just kind of right underneath what I'm thinking about, whether maybe it's not something I'm exploring directly. So hopefully that explains it.
Carolina might have found the book. So she sent a Goodreads link, and it's to a book called Dust, a History of the Small and the Invisible by Joseph, I want to say, Amato.
I think that's the one, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, hey, good job, Carolina.
The one I had, yeah, that looks about right. The one I read had like a red cover, but that's probably the one. Yeah.
That's awesome. We got another question from Victoria, who asks, you also compose and perform music. Is your lyric writing, ooh, I like this question already. Is your lyric writing process similar to your poetry writing process? I was wondering specifically if you write your lyrics first and then create a melody, or vice versa.
This is a good question. This is actually coming from the drummer in the band that I'm in.
Oh, really?
I guess this means that we don't talk about creative processing in the band. So is the lyric writing process similar to the poetry writing process? I don't think so. I think for a number of years with the band, what I would do is I would usually have the chords and kind of a generated melody and kind of singing and humming around stuff. And then I'd be like, I need some words for this. And I would often go to maybe a poem that didn't quite work out, or I wasn't quite happy with it, but it had enough of a cohesive set of images or like kind of a conceit. And then I could just sort of grab onto that and kind of work that into a song. And then I reached a certain point, I think it was in the pandemic, where I kind of ran out of things that I could go rummage in for lyrics as kind of a store for the lyrics. And then there was kind of a split. So now when I'm writing songs, I'm not going to poems to kind of find ideas, lines, images, things like that. I'm just trying to write the song itself and the lyrics. And I tend to try and write now the lyrics like as fast as I can to see if I can just kind of get out of my own way, not overthink things, and kind of get it to work as a song, yeah, without kind of spending too much time. With a poem, I'm gonna overthink things. I'm gonna write things 10 times and change it. And I think I like the idea of sort of this natural approach showing up in the lyrics. Now that sounds kind of weird because the earlier songs definitely don't sound very natural. There was actually some of the songs that we recorded that kind of use some of these geological ideas. As weird as that sounds, there's like geological pop songs that we wrote. And they're kind of, yeah, like indie pop songs, but they're exploring some of these same ideas in kink bands. So I'm not totally sure if that answers your question, Victoria, but I think, yeah, there has been this kind of split in how I write songs, where before maybe I didn't trust my like lyric sensibility quite enough. So I would like just kind of see if I could leap to something that I had already kind of created and using that and apply it to a song. Whereas now I've got the song, the chords, then I come up with a melody, and then seeing if I can come up with something lyrically that's cohesive, but almost kind of developing that in the moment so it sounds kind of natural.
I feel like there's a very cheesy joke about rock music in there somewhere.
There should be.
You find it different performing music and performing poetry, or is it just a similar experience?
I find it quite different. Performing music is probably more satisfying because people clap.
I can see that. Poetry audiences are very polite.
It's also, yeah, and I don't mind. I don't want people to clap for my poems. That kind of throws me off. But I like the idea when I'm performing music. It's sort of like I perform the piece, the audience responds, I perform a piece, and you kind of get this back and forth, some feedback. Whereas with poetry, you're mostly kind of reading your poems, and then maybe at the end, someone will kind of like talk to you, and you get kind of some feedback, like, oh, they really kind of connected with that certain piece. So I like that. Performing music, I think, is definitely more performative. If when I'm playing with the band, I like put on a jacket and a tie, and I've got my trombone or my guitar, and I'm kind of thinking of it as a performance. When I'm sharing poems, I don't usually have them memorized, so it's less of kind of a performative. It's more of a reading. So maybe that's like another distinction, I guess.
Definitely. I like that distinction. Yeah. And then of course there's the moment when poetry and music sort of meet in the spoken word.
Definitely, yes. That's not really my milieu, but for spoken word poets, they're kind of bringing that performative aspect, maybe incorporating music and rhythms and how they're using their voice, and so that's definitely much more of a performance. Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. And then I just immediately thought of William Shatner and the wonderful spoken word poetry that I genuinely like. I think he's great.
Okay.
So,
Awesome.
are there any other questions from anyone at all? If not, we're almost out of time. But yeah, if anyone has any other questions, please put it in the chat now. I'll wait a couple seconds, and if not, we will wrap this up. Thank you for letting me ask all of the questions I had. Excellent. Thank you all for joining us. This was lovely. Thank you so much to Carolina Ortiz for organizing this lovely event. Thank you so much to Audrey's. I'm like motioning to points on my screen. Thank you so much to Audrey's for being our official bookseller. The links to both of David's books are in the chat. Audrey's is a fabulous Edmonton-based bookstore. They host many events. They have a fabulous selection. They've got really cute little finger puppets in there right now. It was like Tiny Shakespeare. I was looking at those the other day. So yes, please support them if you live in Edmonton. If not, support your local bookstore. It is very important. Thank you, David. This was wonderful. It was lovely to see you as always.
Thanks so much. Yeah, this was great.
And thank you, everyone. This has been lovely.
Thanks for coming, everyone.